very much to everybody who's joined us this afternoon from all around the world, I believe. The webinar session today is titled Data Governance with DataBelt. And this session really is about looking at how data as a key commodity, the essential commodity of an organization, should be managed, and how what we call regulatory technology, so the terminology for artificial intelligence and other similar technologies, can help in that sort of process. Through the prism of DataBelt, which is an AIM tool. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today to discuss these sessions by Jonathan Lau from Aguru, and also a colleague of mine, Matt Smith from AIM. I'm Steve Ackland. I'm one of the directors of AIM, and a pleasure to be moderating and discussing the topic this afternoon. And we're not only looking at how data governance and DataBelt tools can actually support an organization in their objectives, but also looking at that through the prism, through the direction of the new Data Protection Act in South Africa, the POPI Act. And today really is an opportunity for looking at how data governance can support data protection, how it can support regulatory and legislative compliance. And we're also hopefully from the UK and the EU, where AIM is based, some experiences that we've had from the EU with the GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation, which was implemented now 2 years ago. So we have some experience which we hope will be of use to those in South Africa who are currently looking at how this legislation may well pan out. And we give some ideas and thoughts around how that will happen. Now, just give a quick view as to how this afternoon is going to go. So we've roughly got an hour set up for this session. We will be going to the guys to introduce themselves very, very shortly and tell a little bit about themselves and what their interests are. And then we move into a series of questions and answers and discussion points. And if you do have any contributions to make through that, then please do raise a hand through the chat function. I'll be checking on that as we actually go through and bring in those comments as they arise, and hopefully push that out to the guys, or maybe I'll have a view as well. So please feel free to do that. There will be a little bit of time at the end to raise any other questions that you have before we close down and summarize the outcome of the session. So without further ado, I'll pass on to the guys, and when we come back at the end, just to let you know that this is being recorded, and there will be the availability of a link to the video and a podcast, and we'll obviously be passing that on to you, to those who have attended the session when it's available. We'll be letting you know how that will work. But without further ado, as I said, let's introduce two colleagues on this call, and I think if we start with you, Johan Lau, and perhaps introduce yourself and give us an overview of Aguru and your interest in this space, please.
Hi, Steve. Thank you. So yeah, I'm joining you from a very cold Cape Town. We've had a couple of cold spells running through snow on the mountain. So yeah, it's chilly. If I'm shivering, it's not because I'm anxious, it's because I'm cold. Yeah, so I founded a company called Aguru Business Solutions, and the idea is that we help companies with their digital transformation process. I started life as a process engineer, got very interested and involved with automation and controls, particularly in large industrial type environments. So I had a career in that space. But yeah, finally took the entrepreneurial bite and bringing all of that expertise of project management and complex interface management to businesses. Of course, particularly in South Africa, we've had, through our economic challenges, we haven't had that many large capital investments. So what we see these days, the companies are shifting towards investments in efficiencies. And this is largely geared towards digitalization, building processes for, like robotic process automation, or using AI to be able to run their businesses more efficiently. And with that comes data. So a huge amount of data being generated, being processed. And of course, that brings us very nicely to our topic of the day, being POPI. So thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to interesting discussion.
Super, thanks, Johan. Matt Smith, would you like to introduce yourself, your interests, and what you hope to contribute today?
Yes, afternoon everybody. So I'm Matt Smith. I head up the pre-sales team at AIM. I've been consulting for around 10 years now, and I started off mainly in the work management space. So we had a couple of very large projects in the UK for clients with a global customer base, implementing some really clever and smart work management systems. Then went on to specialize a little bit more in the ITSM side of things, so IT service management. And then more recently, so the past sort of 3 or 4 years, been specializing in artificial intelligence, things like machine learning and robotic process automation. So that's where my keen interests lie, and that's what we've been doing at AIM with our DataBelt tool. And so today, looking forward to discussing what I've done in my role as head of pre-sales. It's my responsibility at AIM to put together really strong proof of concepts and business cases for our customers, so that they know when they're buying DataBelt, they get a return on investment very soon and understand the full capability of the project through things like pilots and demos and the like. And so I can bring some of that experience to bear in this call, tell you the challenges that our customers are facing and how they're using DataBelt to overcome those.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Matt. So, so as I say, for those, we've had a couple of joiners since we started. So just to say that this is a webinar about data governance with through the prism of DataBelt, and also the South African new data protection Poppy Act. I think probably best thing is to start with the guy on the ground who knows about this and expecting this, is Johan. Can you tell us a little bit around Poppy Act and what your thoughts are around it, please?
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, so I guess the first thing is to say at last we have Poppy, but Poppy is not new. The Act, which is the Protection of Personal Information Act number 4 of 2013, has been around for some time, but there's been quite a delay in the getting to the point where it's now finally proclaimed as being effective. And this year, during the lockdown period due to COVID, our president proclaimed it effective on the 1st of July. And with that comes a 1-year notice period. That means it still gives companies 1 more year to ensure that they are compliant before the information regulator will start having the rights and the powers to be able to install fines or any other forms of penalties that the Act allows. So really, we're looking now at a deadline of the 30th of June 2021, for which all companies have to comply with this Act. Now, I would say it hasn't come a moment too soon. I think through all of the news that we've seen this year around data governance, data breaches, cyber security breaches, and all of these things, and how it has picked up due to or during the period of COVID. I've seen reports of 4-fold, even some 750% increase in data breaches and cyber attacks. And we are not free of that in South Africa. We certainly have been under the suspicion for some time that there's a lot of activity in the market, but not always as transparent. And we certainly excited, I think one should be excited about this regulation, giving us a much better window towards what's happening with organizations, how they are dealing with data, and what the breaches are that they are exposing. It shouldn't be something that's happening behind the scene. It's something that should be visible. And I think it's time, long time, for companies to take that responsibility. Just last night, as I went to supper, I got an SMS from one of our big banks to say that the credit group that kind of underwrites all of the credits has had a breach, and hundreds of thousands of data subjects data has been compromised, has been shared. Now, that in itself is obviously not good news, that there is a breach and there is a notification. But the notification in itself gave me a bit of a chuckle, because it's from a bank that I last banked in 1999. So it means they still have data of me, personal data, to be able to send me an SMS to say that my data is compromised. So thank you very much, Standard Bank. I would love to help you on that one, but I'm no longer a member of the bank. And then this morning, I got an email from the same bank to state similar message. But certainly I'm a suspicious individual when it comes to these types of emails. Then I found that it was sent from Standard Bank without an R in the standard. So obviously already a scamster has picked up on this and has created this environment. So what I'm saying with that, these situations are rife. They're going out there, and everyone needs protection, and it's good time for the POPI Act to be in place.
I think I have to agree with that. And I think something like 108 countries are now going through their own independent journeys to introduce legislation. So we're tracking all those as well, even areas where perhaps like China are also looking at data protection, although it'd be quite interesting to see what they come out with. In terms then, you're extremely well placed, Johan, for seeing what companies are doing, how they are preparing, how they're embracing or otherwise. I mean, I'm sure like in Europe, a number of companies put their heads in the sand for a while leading up to and even after the GDPR regulation went live. Can you give us a sort of a feel for what companies are doing in your experience, and are they doing the right sort of things, do you feel, right now?
So I think we should group companies into three main brackets. I think the first bracket is the guys that are good to go. These are companies that are probably already down the road with GDPR. They're conscious about data protection. They've put things in place. It's often our listed companies or large corporates that have already got very strong governance structures. And they're just flowing from GDPR into POPI. And they should be reasonably good to go. The second group are the late adopters. Those are the companies that might not have a purpose or reason to have given GDPR any attention, and might simplify, and it would not be a good idea, but they simplify what POPI is about. So they're late starters, and they might find themselves in a bit of a problem situation. Of course, then the third group are the denialists. Those are the ones that say it's not applicable to me. I don't have to worry about this. This is all this big company stuff and foreign stuff and so on. And that would, of course, be a grave mistake. I would say to those companies, you've got very little time. Even the 12 months, or now it's less, it's 10 months, is very little time to truly get to grips with what's going on in your business and manage all of the elements that you need to attend to in terms of the act. I think companies that are doing a good job are the ones that understand how data moves into the organization, how it's being processed within the organization, and how the data leaves the organization. And all of that needs to be a controlled process. It means that there needs to be structures and process and governance in place to ensure in no way that anybody with the wrong intentions have access to the data and able to extract or manipulate or transfer the data to other entities. So that at a very high level will be the companies that are paying good attention, taking the right approach. And I think with understanding the scope of the regulation and understanding the timelines, what they need to deliver in, they would be on. There's been a lot of focus around the legal side, the regulation side. I think to some extent there's good information about from the IT perspective. But what I would certainly like to see more is that there's a much stronger discussion that companies has to understand that this is an operational act. This is not an IT act. It's not just a legal act. This is about their operations and their business. So companies that are paying attention to that aspect should find themselves in good stead. But likely also to find that they have lots of loose ends to cover with this act. If you haven't started, okay, you need help. You're going to probably need somebody to help you to understand what your risks are and what are the steps that you need to take. But yeah, I guess it's the three main groups of approaches that people have to adopt.
And interestingly, drawing a parallel with Europe and GDPR, that's exactly how it happened 2 years ago. You tended to have the you mentioned about the group who's already on top of this. They tended to be the larger tier one organisations who had the money and the resources. Obviously, were able to invest, have a team, pull a team together, start looking at it. And then you had all the way down, as you said, to the deniers and small organisations. One thing that we did notice was that, and we'd be interested to track what happens with Poppy, but in the lead up to GDPR going live in May 2018, it was almost like you mentioned 1999 back there in the millennium, and it was very similar to that, whereby you had this sort of huge flurry of panic of organisations which weren't quite sure whether they'd done the right thing or not done the right thing prior to it. And some were sort of prepared. You know, data protection, like cybersecurity, should be a housekeeping function. It's not something that you can decide to leave out. You should really have been doing it anyway. You don't really need legislation to tell you how to manage your business, your data properly. But there's a flurry of panic with organisations who, I think, for the first time saw the regulation or the Data Protection Act in the UK and relevant equivalent legislations in European countries. And they tried to work out, crikey, what's the minimum we have to do? And what you had was a series of very, very small sticking plasters on what they needed to do to be absolute minimum. And as we said before, you know, it was down to things like, for example, sending out an email to everybody that they'd ever spoken to, that they thought they'd ever spoken to or be in contact with, to say, do you want us to retain your data or not? Putting cookie controls on their website, or having consent removed potentially on the website if you didn't want to be contacted. And they thought that was good enough. And a lot of organizations, particularly the smaller ones, went along that road for a good year until the regulators started getting a little bit of teeth. Then they started exercising, as you said, their sort of controls and their ability to look at organisations and issue fines where they felt that organisations' data protection posture wasn't good enough, or where there had been a breach, for example. Then I think it started to get serious. Then you had sort of the second wave of activity, whereby organisations were coming out, asking for help, looking at how they were doing things, and trying to embed the whole process a little bit more strongly than they had been previously. And of course, coincided once again with yet more data losses was quite important. But I think one thing that I'm interested, Johan, in your view, again around Southern African companies, is that data protection, as I was saying earlier, you know, it's really a housekeeping function. It's no different to looking after staff, looking after your finances, really. It's looking after data. And data, really, in our experience, is probably one of the least understood areas, strangely enough, in an organisation, despite its absolute criticality to what a business does. And I'm interested in hearing what your views are around organizations in South Africa about how they understand their data. And as you said, you know, why in the example of your bank, they're hoarding data. Clearly they're not cleansing data, they're not removing data, they're not checking how old this data is since it really was last used or you last had an account. I just wanted, again, what your views are in South Africa, what the status is on understanding of data.
Very good question, and I guess it's a point that will be have to be contextualized in each organization. So I'm definitely going to be generalizing. I think there are companies that understand that data is a valuable asset. And again, those would be the tier one companies, or perhaps not all of them, but certainly companies that are very, very focused to understand that how data flows through the organization is an asset to their business. If they can optimize that, then they're going to extract the most value. Then there are the companies that are just producers. They generate data. They don't have sufficient control of how their data is flowing. They constantly have problems with servers and data lakes and data not communicating, always on projects with master data. Those companies, you will find that there's always a project saying we need to solve master data. There are people assigned to resolve the master data. And as you say, it's about putting a plaster on rather than really getting to the core of understanding how data will be generated. I think certain things like cloud solutions that's coming into play is going to create difficulties for companies like that, because it's easier to generate data and externalize data. And in terms of the Act, where we now have the definition of an operator, that's the company that the responsible party can outsource some of its data processing activities, is further extending that boundary of where data exists. So those companies are the ones that are going to struggle because they have massive amounts of data, but they don't have control. The next step of the companies are ones that are better at generating the data, controlling the data, but they haven't actually identified the full value that they can get from data. And they would be reasonably good to manage compliance, but they will still be exposed once they start delivering projects that serve data and generate data better to, whether it's in their processes or their marketing or all of these spaces. I would say to companies like that, you actually haven't got the full value of data. Perhaps you very focused on the compliance part, but you haven't actually extracted the full value from the data. And of course, then at the last end would be the companies that are, again, the denialist. It's chaos. They actually haven't got a good a data framework. They're not generating data. And they would also be exposed to cyber attacks and all of those very technical things when it comes to the data landscape. But for me, that continuum, and I guess one wants to work backwards. You want to go to that first definition that I have. But you want to get to a state where you have an organization that is efficient in generating data, it's efficient at processing data, it's stand up to all governance, compliance, regulation, but ultimately it's something that moves to the balance sheet as a true asset to the business, which they can then exploit to maximize the value for the shareholders.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm going to bring Matt Smith in to tell us a little bit around how DataBelt can actually help in all these areas and understanding that value, because as you quite rightly say, Johan, the value can apply in all sorts of aspects, from loss through to monetization, through to all other sources. But Michael Gray has raised a question, and he said as follows: Popia has the same effect as GDPR in Europe. You don't keep to any rules because there's no one stopping you. In terms of contrast with GDPR, I mean, GDPR is not so much down to the level, I think, that POP is going, and also to add to the fact that there are thresholds within organisations such that you have to be of a certain size, for example, to have certain governance controls and roles in place, such as a data protection officer. What's the equivalent, Johan, in Popia there? I think it goes down a lot lower level, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that would be one of the critical mistakes that the company can make, that has perhaps focused on attending to GDPR, to simplify and say, well, I'm okay, I'm under the threshold for Popia. Popia applies to everybody, so every organization, even if you're a one-man organization, requires a information officer. That information officer needs to be notified to our information regulator. And that company, that entity, is a responsible party in terms of the Act. Now, there's a very interesting difference between Popia and GDPR. Popia allows for juristic persons as well as natural persons, both from a responsible party perspective. And you would say, well, that makes sense. It's a business, it's a juristic person, but also from a data subject perspective. So it means that the data subject can also be a juristic person, which is different to GDPR, where it's only data associated with a natural person.
Yep.
So that's a very interesting difference. Of course, there's terminology differences. So we've got the data protection officer for GDPR, who kind of acts independently. He would report to the supervisory authority if there's any non-compliance or something of the sort, but he's not responsible for that compliance. Where with Popia, the information officer, so the information officer will be appointed by the responsible party. By default, it's the CEO of the business or the managing director, but it can be assigned to an information officer. And that information officer has got much more a change management, a compliance orientation function. He's changing the culture. He's making sure that all the processes are in place and has therefore a very critical actor in that process. But the law or the regulation in terms of that responsibility or the accountability finally still lies with the CEO and with the board of the company. So you can't outsource that responsibility or the accountability completely to the information officer. I think then there's also differences in the teeth that the regulator has. There are some distinct differences between GDPR and POPIA. Of course, GDPR has much bigger fines. I mean, we see big percentages of revenue, etc. In South Africa, the regulation is basically for the lesser fines, it's 1 million rand or up to one year in imprisonment and a maximum of 10 million rand and 10 years imprisonment. So there's definitely a criminal as well as a civil offense that can take place, and the Act is very clear about where each of those applies. I think to the question from gentlemen was that again there's a law, but there isn't that much in terms of power to enforce this law. So firstly, the information regulator is a small team. It's really made up of 5 people. But then there's an extended team. There's a CEO and an administrative function that will obviously be able to manage all of the other details. But the regulator as such is made up of a chair, 2 functional full-time members and 2 part-time members. And they are likely to have their hands full, not because of them finding non-compliances, but by the requirement for companies to report if there's a data breach, for the opportunity for a data subject to raise a complaint with a regulator, and the regulator has the power to claim for damages on behalf of the data subject. So there's a very interesting dynamic that's going to come into play there. I think it's not so much the stick that is the way forward or how the Act will be used, but it's available to the regulator. I think it's much more of a carrot aspect where companies are encouraged to drive compliance and start using compliance then as an enabler and enforcer of their business. I want to do business with you because I'm confident that you've got everything in place, you're compliant, and my data that's being moved to you is in good hands. And I think that is where the Act is really going to help us, and companies will drive each other to get to that point.
I totally agree, and I think there's too much emphasis made on the negative and the penalties, not enough on the opportunities. And as you quite rightly say, like anything, people want to work with organisations who are fit and proper, do things correctly, and look after the data that they use. And relatively recent survey in the States said for consumers said that something like over 70% of people generally will not deal with organisations who have a bad record on looking after consumer data. So I think that sort of says everything about loyalty, which obviously nowadays is absolutely key to future business. Thank you for that. I think it's a good point at this juncture to bring in Matt. Obviously, Matt, you've been working with data now, as you said, for a number of years, and AI and how that supports areas and GDPR in Europe. And obviously you started to see the growth and expansion of data protection legislation, some of which is based on GDPR, some of which of course is completely homegrown into other areas and other regions. Give us a quick overview perhaps of how DataBelt has been designed to look and support data protection and all the requirements and processes surrounding that, please.
Sure. So I'm a bit of a telescope geek, so I'll start off with an analogy, so please bear with me. So in terms of how DataBelt helps companies, if you imagine in the past you had some traditional challenges when it came to using a telescope on the ground. You couldn't see the stars and the galaxies because you had clouds, you had atmospheric interference, you had light pollution and the like. So although you might have the world's most expensive telescope, you couldn't actually use it properly. It's actually very similar to my situation in Kent for all the light pollution we have and all the clouds. And DataBelt attempts to do and does do a process of actually removing those traditional challenges, of course not clouds, light pollution and atmospheric interference, but around data. So the traditional challenges with data is around not understanding where it's located, not understanding the ontology of the data and how it is related to each other. And so that's what DataBelt does. It overcomes those traditional challenges and allows organizations to see their data clearly and in its entirety. And if you think of some of the examples in terms of GDPR and the rights that we make available to our data subjects, you've got certain things like a DSAR, so a data subject access request. And this is where a data subject can go to an organization. So such as I could go to my bank, similar to Johan's point earlier, and say, I want to understand what information you hold on me. I want to see that. I also have the right to be forgotten. So I could say, all that data that you hold on me, I want you to delete it. There's also things around the freedom of information requests. Yeah, I might contact a legislative body or an organization and say, I want to understand the data that you hold on this type of thing. And there's also rules around data retention. So, let's say you can only hold data for a certain amount of years, in which case, Johan's point earlier, there may be some non-compliance with Johan, being in a bank 10 years ago and then getting a text, although of course possibly from a scammer. So there's all these different rights that we have, and if you've got that sort of light pollution, that cloud issue, the analogy with my telescope, you cannot see the data and you can't understand it. And what we're doing at the moment, we've got some really interesting examples where we're working with law enforcement, is they have certain rules around how long certain types of data can be held. So as an example, if I'm arrested or I'm interviewed by police, I would have a custody photo taken of me, and depending on the nature of the crime and how long ago it was, that data needs to be removed. And of course, if you don't have a tool like DataBelt, and we can come on to more how that works shortly, it's very difficult to search across your entire data estate and find all instances where Matt Smith lives within your data. It's very hard to let's say there was some text contained in that photograph, such as a crime reference number. How do you tease out that text from that photograph and be able to hold it as metadata so that it is searchable? So all these very complex search requirements that organizations have because of those things that GDPR, those things that allow our data subjects to ask for. And so really, as I said earlier, in terms of the telescope example, if you cannot see your data and you can't understand it in its entirety, it's very hard to be compliant with the acts that we're talking about.
Steve, if I can quickly come in here just to follow on a point there from Matt, and also back to a point I made earlier, I think that we're going to see a lot of companies having interaction with each other because of where Popia as a juristic person for the data subject, having the right to say, company X, what information do you have on me? The Act allows for that to be a process that's done at no cost. So I can ask any of my banks, or I can ask a previous employer, or I can say, what data do you have on me? And they cannot charge me for it. They have to answer within reasonable time, the access, but they can then ask what is the detail. So the data subject can request that all of that information is being made available to check for quality or de-identification, whatever the purpose might be after that. But that's a right that is being given to the data subject. And because a juristic person can ask that question, it means one company can ask for that information from another company. They can charge for the cost. So if I'm being requested from a data subject, I have to answer them, yes, I have got information on you, no cost. But the next question is, okay, give me that information. I can charge them to be able to produce that information. Right. But nevertheless, this is something that will have to be dug out. Now, here's an example. At some point, somebody has a disciplinary. Okay, so there's a few managers in the organization, and there's a disciplinary process. And now information are being shared around on email, excuse me, it's a disciplinary report, perhaps past information, etc. Would I be correct to say that an employer will now be at breach. Let's say that person have now left the organization, and they now putting a request to the organization and say, please give me all the information that you have on me. And they would go to the server, and they will go to the HR system, and they will say, oh yeah, it is Johan, here's all the information we have on you, or if it's somebody else. But in the meantime, there's all of this other sensitive information that exists on other people's computers. It could be saved somewhere on another server or something like that, because it's not in the primary system. That would be not completely attending to the requirements of the Act. Does DataBelt have that ability to go and find that information?
Yeah, so probably just trying to think of the best way of explaining DataBelt, really. I mean, at its heart, it is a work management platform. So it allows teams to access the system, understand the tasks that are expected of them, and carry out. But to address your point, Johan, in terms of does it have that capability to do that searching and that crawling? Absolutely. It's actually one of the unique features that DataBelt has. And it has this data crawler capability. And what we do is we install DataBelt within a client organization. And the crawler goes out and iteratively goes through all the different folders and file structures and the like. And it finds every single file that it has access to within the customer organization. And we're talking about structured, unstructured data, things like Google Drives, things like databases, indeed, SharePoint, for example. And it will find that information and it will index it. And the really important thing about the index is you may have an organization that has gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes of data. That index is then around 1 to 3% of the size of the organization's entire data estate. So that's the first thing that it does. But of course, just indexing the data isn't quite enough. You can search on that information and that's useful, but there's so many more things, sort of tags and classifications that go along with our data that is important when it comes to searching on things that we're talking about here, like the rights that our data subjects have. What it does after it does its index is it does its classification run. And what this is, imagine you have a requirement in your organization and you want to understand all data across the estate that relates to an individual. So you may say, I want to find everything that has a national insurance number or a date of birth, something along those lines. And what we have in DataBelt is the ability to set up these regular expressions. So it's a way of defining what does a date of birth look like, what does a national insurance number look like. And so when DataBelt captures all of these files and it takes the information from them, it'll then run the classification engine and it'll say, right, I've got a file here and it contains personal information because it has the date of birth tag or it has the address tag, whatever it might be. And then on top of that, slightly away from GDPR and POPIA, is it also does a data valuation. So it's possibly something for another webinar for us to discuss, of course, but data is valuable within organizations, especially if you're looking to sell. And it's very important to understand what the value of that data is. So just to kind of reiterate really that process, DataBelt does the crawler, finds all the information, teases the information out of those files, and then runs its classification and its valuation engines. And I think one thing just to point out as well, we're not just talking about Word documents and Excel spreadsheets. That would be very easy. We're talking about things like phone recordings. DataBelt will transcribe the audio that is contained within phone recordings so that you can search on them. It also uses artificial intelligence. So you might have a classification trying to find, you might be looking for a Father Christmas, let's say, wherever he appears within your data estate. You create a model that looks like Father Christmas and that you load images of Father Christmas into DataBelt and it will find everything that matches. It also uses OCR, so optical character reading, to find text that is within images and again tease that information out so it can be searched on. So it's not just about finding the data and indexing it, it's also about parsing the information that exists within those files. So whether it's text, audio, image, video, you will get out the information that you need to be able to search on it.
What
And I
you're
think
saying is that if I've been part of a webinar, I can ask a company to extract their voice recording because I'm there, I'm identified, and DataBelt will be able to search all their massive data lake to be able to zero in to find that specific bit of data.
Absolutely.
Where I appear on video or audio.
So, for an example, we're going to be obviously saving this webinar as a file within our database. And if we received a data subject access request from Johan, and he says, please find everywhere where I am across your organization, you may not find this webinar recording using traditional means because we don't call it webinar with Johan. We call it the DataBelt webinar. So what we would do, and this is the great thing, this doesn't involve coding. This is something that somebody like a business analyst or a data analyst or processor within an organization can carry out using DataBelt, is that they would construct a model of Johan. So maybe feed in 10 or so images, Johan, of you that we can find or that you provide to us possibly. We create that model and we run it across the data estate. So any images where you are found, any videos where you are, they will come back. And of course, because it's artificial intelligence, it's not always infallible. If you and I looked more similar, it may find me. But that's where training the model, of course, is important. And it will give a percentage match. So let's say it was a little bit unsure because maybe, at the moment, if your lighting was worse, we might not be able to see your face as well. There'd be a percentage match. But I think one of the more usual use cases that we come across quite regularly is an organization is very interested in, let's say, understanding everywhere where a vendor contract exists across their estate. Let's say they're having issues with their vendor and they haven't been keeping very good records. And let's say vendor contracts are actually scanned and uploaded to a database somewhere or multiple databases, and they want to find them. What we do is we would construct, or they would construct, a model of what the vendor contract looks like. So they would feed in maybe 5, 10, 15 copies of the vendor contracts that they know of. And DataBelt would learn what that model looks like. It says, right, we've got some text at the top. We then have a blue bar. We then have a table. And then we have a footer at the bottom. And it would understand what that model is. That model then gets trained against the index. And DataBelt will say, right, I've now also found these additional 20 vendor contracts that you weren't aware of, and be able to actually present those to the user through DataBelt's front end. So some very powerful AI capability there.
And of course, to add to that and to Johan's point, one of the problems with GDPR and subject access requests is finding everything about somebody, and particularly malicious behaviours maybe from somebody. I mean, we've noticed, for example, that subject access requests are often as a result of some dispute, some recruitment dispute, perhaps, whereby somebody has been taken on, maybe needs to be removed from post, and they decide they're actually going to issue a subject access request on the basis that either delays the process of removing them from the organisation, or they feel that the organisation not going to be in a position to actually take all that information and find it. And you get a lot of that, having access to your information where it is for everybody. There are no areas that you can't see in your data is absolutely key, and that's not just around GDPR. Of course, that's so many other areas as well. And I think the sort of areas again that Matt has brought out really are delivering big benefits. So again, if we're looking at an organisation, seeing the opportunities rather than just the penalties, then having technology to allow it to generate and have that level of understanding is great, because it's not just around knowing what there is and preparing for people who are going to ask for their information, but also it does things like knowing what your data is, why are we holding it, what are our costs of storage, for example. Why are we paying for this money for storage on a cloud, and it doesn't really ever get access, has been accessed for 10 years. So all those sorts of areas as well are really, really key to understanding your data. Matt, in terms, sorry, yeah, Johan.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, so other than just trying to find those Christmas party pictures that you don't don't want to be going around any longer. What I'm understanding then is there's a very powerful capability to actually look at how data is moving through an organization. So there's part compliance subject, but there's also part data management, data flow subject. And this is a critical aspect in M&A. I mean, if you want to divest the business or you want to acquire a business, these are now very important subjects to ask questions around your data value and compliance.
Oh, absolutely right. And as I say, we're sort of moving away a little bit, but as you quite rightly say, whether you're on the sell side or the buy side, if you're on the sell side, you want to promote your organisation as having been well run and compliant. And if you're on the buy side, you want to make sure that you're taking an organisation that doesn't have all sorts of little grenades fizzing away, ready to explode once you've taken that on. So, and the need for data protection and cybersecurity are absolutely key, and understanding and having that confidence, and using a tool perhaps like DataBelt to actually show on one side or the other, it's a due diligence or as part of like a seller's pack to the market, to show them that in fact you are operating in a good place, and you do apply risk management, and you do know what your data is, and it is well classified, and it's all within its retention requirements, retention date requirements and policies, is a very, very positive thing. And as we've seen, some companies that go through the M&A process can have millions or even billions added to their valuation simply because people look at them and think, yeah, this is a great company, I really want to buy that, and I know I'm buying real quality. So it really, really helps to make sure that you actually do that. The other area which again we've noticed as a direction of travel is data protection is not a standalone feature, and you'll find that obviously in any country, and I think during POPIA it will come all the more to the focus. In the data protection is part of a continuum of all sorts of other disciplines around data. So whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's risk, whether it's compliance, all those areas, data protection is part of it. Because as we well know, if you have a data protection issue arising from a cyber security attack, for example, then data possibly has been compromised, and you may well have your customer your customers' data may have been stolen and used. That could therefore lead to potentially a fraudulent activity. It may well be they take their ID theft, or they're taking their company cards and using them to extract money, or some sort of ransomware. And of course, if that is the case, then not only do you need to involve your risk team, but you also need to involve your compliance team. So you're automatically bringing together data protection as being a linchpin of all these other areas as well. And certainly over in European countries, in the UK, the Information Commissioner, who is the person with legal and government responsibility for ensuring the Data Protection Act is obviously implemented correctly. They are the ones who fine organisations, and they are very, very clear how they need organisations to make sure that they report on these breaches. Who's been compromised? Have you let the consumers know their data has been taken, and what the consequences of those are? And an organisation has only 3 days to actually inform the ICO that has actually happened. Now, I'm sure that's going to be happening in POPIA, absolutely no doubt. That's very, very important. And of course, with that very, very tight SLA, what you can't afford to do, an organisation of any size, is to then manually run around. If you have been compromised, God forbid anybody does, but if you have been compromised, to run around and find out all that information as quickly as you need to, compile it into a report with a reason, what happened, when it happened, how it happened, how you're going to remediate that for the future, and send it off to your regulator within a matter of days. So a tool again like DataBelt will, I think I'm right, Matt, help you do all those sorts of things. So it's very much again a data-led system rather than a report-driven type of system, correct?
Indeed, and that's where the classifications really come into it. As I said before, it's not enough just to index your data and be able to search on it, but you need to understand the risk, the sensitivity of that data. So as an example, if we know that a certain server has been compromised, it would take us possibly days or weeks to trawl through all of that information and work out the importance of that data. Whereas if you have tags built into a tool such as DataBelt, such as whether it's personal information, sensitive information, financial information, when that index is run, it will understand that that server is of high importance in terms of its sensitivity and its privacy issues. So you know immediately, actually, we do have a large issue here, and we know what has been compromised. Or possibly, if it was just a personal server where I'm just storing my holiday snaps, I might not have such a big issue to deal with. So it's really speeding up that time and understanding, the true impact of a data breach by understanding the classification of your data.
Matt, have you been able to get any kind of metrics about what that sort of reduction in effort would be from a manual to a DataBelt process?
Yeah, we've seen up to 97% improvement. Wow. And this was benchmarked. It's been benchmarked a lot of times in our clients' organizations. So if you look at something like a data subject access request, we've seen it, up to 97% improvement versus. And then when you look at cost, it's very different. If you're looking at hiring 10 people to work 2 weeks to go through some databases, the cost of that is very large, compared to something like DataBelt that will actually already give you that information. So not only is it quicker, but much more cost effective as well than just using pure manpower alone.
And I think that's the essence then of Popya. It is about risk management. It's about ensuring that you've got a hand on personal information that's moving into and through your organization. I think from the responsible party to the operator. So those are the companies that are now making use and processing data outside the primary entity. They're going to be able to be fit on their feet. The regulator requires the operator to advise immediately to the responsible party if there's any type of breach or issue. The act is a little bit different between the responsible party and the regulator. It seems to allow for some time to make sure that the necessary assessment and perhaps bringing in the law before it is notified. But there's now a flow of information that needs to happen from the operator to the responsible party to the regulator with some speed, because the intent after all is to ensure the best interest of the data subject or data subjects that has been impacted. And it's exactly what we saw last night, and the news today is a big breach. Lots of communications are going out to say certain people are compromised, and you have to start taking actions to prevent yourself, for being further compromised from that initial compromise. And I think companies are going to have to be fit on their feet to be able to serve that process.
Absolutely. We're into the last 5 minutes of the webinar. So finishing off, and obviously if anybody in the audience have any further questions, then please send them over and we'll get them in beforehand before we close. But Johan, perhaps you'd like to give us a quick overview now of what a guru will be doing to track as Popya comes into effect. What are you going to be doing to help organizations monitor advisory roles, perhaps? So if people want to get in touch with you and find out a little bit more, let us know what they should do as well.
Yeah, so we can be contacted on our website, which is aguru.co.za, aguru, or email info@aguru.co.za. The idea is that we look at a holistic approach for organizations, not just a pure focus on Popya compliance. There are a number of actors in the market as well, specifically on the legal space that is looking at necessary advice. I think what we're trying to do is to look at a more holistic approach to organizations for their digital transformation strategy. So it could include something like a digital maturity assessment. It could look at identifying data flows in the organization. Your digital transformation process is strongly linked to what is the decision-making and flow of information going through the organization. So when you digitalize, you want to make sure that you understand that, particularly if you want to try to get efficiencies. So there's questions to be asked there, and that's where we can certainly advise. If companies are already in a relative maturity, they're generating a lot of data, then the next step is, of course, to help with that compliance. We can make use of a tool like DataBelt to be able to get that assessment done. But I think what's important for them is that they understand that this compliance is a continuous process. So how do you have a tool that to keep available to you, that can give you the dashboard, see what's there, and progressively then evolve the organizational culture? I think that's where our advisory work comes in. And then finally, it's bringing it all together. When we integrate systems, is to ensure that each of those elements of these complex digital systems are cognizant and are performing in accordance with POPIA compliance, so that we don't introduce any weaknesses in our operational flows or in our digital activities. And we're keen to add value in that respect.
Super, thanks very much. And Matt, in terms of you and your role in the system, Johan made some very valid points there about the importance of this not just being a one-off. It can be, of course, to understand where you need to be, but obviously, there needs to be a process behind this. Again, your experience, DataBelt can be used both as a sort of due diligence tool as well as an ongoing tracking, monitoring, and looking at the health of your data.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think when it comes to a DataBelt implementation, it's all around the short term, the medium term, and the long term benefits of using it. So, of course, the benefits differ based on industry. So when you think about M&A or law enforcement or social media, whatever it might be, the challenges are very different. So therefore, the benefits are very different. However, things like the GDPR and POPIA are things that impact all industries, all companies, regardless of industry. So if we just focus on those in terms of the short-term benefits, you can understand your compliance very quickly. So what is our compliance status? What needs to be fixed? And then in the short to medium term, you then put in that corrective action. So we can now say, indeed, we are compliant and we have the right processes in place. And then the longer term benefits is that really DataBelt is sitting there almost as an internal regulator of sorts, so that these processes need to be well-oiled machines and they need to be looked after, and that is a big job in itself. So having DataBelt in place will then flag up where you do have anomalies. So maybe we have sensitive data that is sitting on a publicly facing drive. Those are the types of non-compliance that you want to be flagged up very quickly, and DataBelt allows you to have that ongoing check of your data health, your compliance status, etc.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. So we're at the end of our time. I haven't got any more questions from the audience, although we've got another 30 seconds if you do have any last minute, but feel free to route any further questions or queries you have through to Johan. So I'd like to thank the audience for attending this afternoon. I hope you found that useful and some interesting points out of it. I'd obviously like to thank Johan from Guru and Matt Smith from AIM for also contributing to the process. And as I mentioned, we're taking recording. There'll be a podcast of this made available, and that will be sent out to everybody who attended the session today. Please feel free to make use of some of the experts you heard today, particularly Johan in South Africa and his team. We're delighted and honoured to be partnering with our group and looking at how we collectively can support organisations through their data and through their understanding of digital transformation. So we're very, very pleased to be running these sorts of sessions with a guru. Unless anybody has any further points to make, I will bid you farewell for this afternoon. Have a good rest of day and weekend, and I hope to see you on the webinar again soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.